Today's video is about the generational cycle of power going from victim today to oppressor tomorrow. I think it's definitely worth looking at, and I think it's something that's going to expand your mind, make you more exposed, and be more aware of the things that play out where sometimes you may not be as conscious, but it could have a significant impact on your life and your life trajectory and those of generations to come. If that sounds good, buckle up. We're going to have an interesting journey. Let's get into it. I just noticed how some generational cycles or patterns seem to repeat themselves. And sometimes it's generational, meaning you as a person, your family line. It could also mean where you repeat the things that happened to you. It could be somebody else that had an impact on you, but then you repeat that against somebody else, usually in situations that are not positive, right? So these are situations like the bully becoming the bullied, or abusive children who had abusive parents becoming abusive themselves. Different examples in this sort of regard. All right, so the first time I became somewhat conscious of this was actually during my master's. I did a master's at Birkbeck University in the UK, and it was called, the title of the master's was Education, Power, and Social Change. But one of the things we talked about ever so briefly, but it marked me so much, was the issue of power and realizing that power has many dimensions. Sometimes some people who you think don't have enough power, don't have much power, actually have more power than you expect. And just how power sort of impacts people in different ways. All right, let's get into it. So in this class, it mentioned something about how sometimes those who are victimized or oppressed, rather than seeking to just no longer be oppressed, sometimes they actually go to the other extreme where they are looking to then get into the position where they can be the oppressor. Now, that can be very dangerous. And many times you will think, oh, if I was bullied, I would never want anybody to go through what I went through, so I wouldn't do that to somebody else. But actually, that's what we say sometimes. And if you're conscious enough to say that, that's great. But oftentimes, we find that we're often waiting for the time when we get to the position where we can be in that position to oppress, to be the bully. It seems a bit weird, right? You would think, okay, I'm a good person. I would never do that. Let me show you. So going through my notes. So for example, you see situations where people hated how they were treated when they were children, right? It could be by a family member, it could be by teachers, it could be by other students. And as adults, they have a choice, sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious, between repeating the same thing that happened to them, so moving from victim to oppressor, or being able to break the cycle such that that cycle no longer continues, So, for example, I know a boy who often talked about how he saw his grandfather was very abusive. He always resorted to shouting and intimidation to get his way in anything, and so he was definitely a big bully. He knows his father hated it, but he also saw that his father did the same thing. The very things that his father complained about his own father, so the very things that the father complained about the grandfather about, was the same thing the son started complaining about the father about. But it didn't end there. We started to see the same trait in the son with his younger brother. So there was a good, let's say almost a decade difference in age between him and his brother. And in watching them, I also found that this boy would also use fear, intimidation, shouting, and just because he's physically bigger than his younger brother, to intimidate his younger brother. And then I could see this happening generation to generation. Each generation complained about it, but somehow each generation justified it when they were in the position where they could inflict such oppression, in a sense. I was like, oh, this is interesting. But you say you hate this, you say you wish people weren't like this, and yet you do the same thing. Because I think my theory is that people, and I think somebody has said this in the past, unfortunately, I don't remember whose idea it was, is that we gravitate towards familiarity as opposed to gravitating towards what we know as good or what we know as better. And it's just something you wonder, okay, is this boy who's doing this to his younger brother going to end up doing the same to his son later? And then each generation complains about the same thing, but each generation repeats the cycle? That's a question there. But then, it's also a thing where when I talk about gravitating towards the familiar, I'm not talking about, what I'm not going to talk about today is where people who are victims continually find themselves in cycles of being the victim. That's not what I'm talking about today. But I do want to digress and say that it's why sometimes you find people who have been in adverse positions find themselves back in those positions in some way or another. So, for example, a girl who grew up with an abusive father or abusive parents may find that the guys she ends up being attracted to or ends up being with end up being those having those same or similar traits. Again, because her default programming is attracted to what she's used to, the familiar. It takes very conscious effort to make a decision not to follow the default programming you might have, but actually go towards something better. It takes a really conscious effort to go against the grain. I mean, the first few years of our lives, we spend imitating, we spend absorbing the world, absorbing what we know the world to be, absorbing what we believe life should be and how our ways of being. We copy the people from around us. So when those things are very ingrained in us, it takes really conscious effort to actually make the step, the bold step, to deviate from it and not to sink back to it. The scary part is sometimes we're not even aware that we are repeating patterns. We're not even aware that we're doing the same things we despised being done to us, but we're doing it to other people. It's a similar case to a boy in school, for example. In his younger years, he was bullied by his classmates for one reason or another. Maybe he had a defect of some sort, or maybe he was, there are different reasons why people get bullied, right? It might be hair color, it might be height, it could be athletic ability, all sorts of things, or just maybe coming from a poorer background than his classmates. And then he gets to a point where he builds a chip on his shoulder. He gets into a situation where he is now maybe more advanced. He may then choose to be the bully, be the oppressor, and just to enjoy the power and get drunk, in a sense, on the power he felt he did not have in the past. Or something I've even heard of in Nigerian secondary schools. I was only in secondary school in Nigeria for a short time, so I didn't experience it. But basically where you have seniors bullying the juniors, and then the juniors grow older, obviously the seniors that bullied them have left the school. But then when they get into the position of being the seniors themselves, they repeat those patterns that were inflicted on them. But then you have the stories of nice seniors who don't do that to their juniors. But again, it's a case of I've been oppressed. I'm waiting for the situation where I get to oppress other people. But that is dangerous. And you can see you're repeating the cycle that you hated and did not benefit you in any way. You're inflicting that pain on somebody else. Here are 4 reasons I believe this happens. The first could be hypervigilance as a trauma response. So you're overcompensating and acting aggressively to avoid being hurt again. So you feel like, it's a dog eat dog world. It's either you're eaten or you eat. And so if it's a case where be bullied or be the bully, you choose to be the bully. But then the question is that the only option? Is that the only option? Sometimes it feels like that is the case, but many times it may not be. One needs to just, again, think deeper and make conscious efforts when that is concerned. 2, a distorted self-perception. It's possible to see yourself as a defender of the weak or someone fighting for the wellness of, or for the wellness of other people or fighting against unfairness. And yet in your own life, you are also perpetuating some of the negatives that you're fighting against. In life, what is it? Is it a juxtaposition or oxymoron, or I can't remember what the word is, but where there's like some cognitive dissonance, where I think that's the word, where you have 2 things that conflict existing side by side. And it is possible to be somebody who is a helper, somebody who helps people rather than hurt, but then also be a person who also hurts people as well. So for example, you might be somebody who's great at your job, but also you might also be the workplace bully. And so these 2, yes, you are valuable to the team in terms of the impact you bring, but you're also detrimental to the team because of the impact you have on other team members. A third is lack of reflection. So not taking time to think deeply on how your actions actually affect other people. In a sense, it's very easy to cry victim. Oh, I'm the one who people are doing this to, I'm being treated unfairly. But have you stopped to consider whether some of your actions are actually perpetuating the same impact on other people? Are you treating other people unfairly as well? That's a question. And sometimes we can be so consumed with the hurt that we faced that we just don't consider the hurt of other people or the fact that we are causing hurt to other people as well. Then there's power dynamics. So for somebody who's been in a position of oppression for a very long time, when they get to power, rather than think about using their power for good, they think no. They may think, or it may even be done unknowingly. They may just abuse that power, and that often happens. I mentioned the example of secondary school, how seniors bully juniors, and then when the juniors eventually become seniors, they repeat the cycle. And this is often because you can't take it out on the original oppressors, therefore you take it out on those who you can oppress. And so the cycle continues. So what's the solution? What would stop a person from going from victim to oppressor as opposed to going from victim to helper or victim to cycle breaker? I mean, we've been talking a lot about exposure, and exposure is, the point of exposure is to make you a better person and somebody who not only knows better, but is better and does better. So there's a good point in not being the oppressor, because you're just perpetuating a cycle that will impact the people around you, that would impact the people who maybe generations that come after you as well. And you want to break that so that you can be, in a sense, the light in your generation. You can do better. So first of all would be noticing the issue. And that can happen in two ways. One was one I mentioned before, which is self-reflection. So actually stopping and asking yourself, okay, were my actions today beneficial? Did I do something that could affect somebody adversely in a way that I already recognized that I didn't like, or I wouldn't like if I was in that situation? That's something to ask yourself. Then another would be to actually get feedback from people, but in getting feedback, you want to get it from people who are free enough to be honest with you. That's why sometimes when you're speaking to people who maybe might be your subordinates or people who report to you, it may be tricky actually getting honest feedback, particularly if you were the kind of person who intimidated in the past or can be found intimidating. And so you want to figure out ways of getting feedback from the right people and feedback that can be constructive as well. So it might be that you speak to somebody who is your peer or somebody who's a mentor who may also have visibility on how you are with other people, or who can assess a certain situation and give you feedback, genuine feedback, where they won't have any fear of being intimidated, because that is one of the issues for some people. And then also they can just give you clear, direct feedback to say, okay, have you noticed this? There are many things that we may have as blind spots we just don't notice, but they actually have a huge impact. And so being able to have and leverage friends and people who can be honest with you to tell you, okay, what you're doing right now is not great, is not good, you should fix this, it's something good. And obviously you want somebody who can see those things and isn't a perpetuator themselves. Then you can also look at dealing with instincts. So that's your emotional regulation. So let's say you're somebody who has a tendency towards anger and flaring up and, resorting to intimidation. Maybe you could figure out and find out what steps you could take to help you reduce that sort of behavior. Now, let's say growing up in your family, the usual thing is when somebody's angry, they flare up, they shout. Maybe you could be the cycle breaker. So instead of being the person who, again, just repeats the cycle and saying, oh, that's how we do things in our family, maybe what you might do is try and figure out ways of being a bit more gentle, not reacting to certain situations, but actually choosing your response. So for example, it could be things as simple as deep breathing. It could be some meditation. It could actually be seeking professional counsel, so either therapy or speaking to a counselor. So the key here is to choose your response to things as opposed to reacting. So someone does something that upsets you or makes you angry, your first reaction shouldn't be to lash out. It shouldn't be to just jump out and, have a go at them, but actually take a step back, hold off your reaction and think, okay, what is the best response in this? Another thing to look at is if I was in that situation, if I was in that person's situation, how would I want to be treated? And then go from there. This is definitely not exhaustive, but it might help somebody in terms of dealing with anger or dealing with how you you react. And then in so doing, yes, sometimes it might seem painful. Yes, it might feel like, oh, I had power and I didn't use it. But what you're doing is something even bigger with your power, which is breaking a cycle, which would have benefits to people beyond yourself. And even if your anger is valid, bear in mind that the impact of your explosion could be far further reaching than what you think. You might think, okay, it's just your way of letting go of things, and once you let go of things, that's it. The issue's done. But hold on. It's done for you, but then the impact on the person you've just dealt with could have multiplier effects. And so you want to be in a sense empathetic. And that's another thing we're going to talk about after. Being empathetic, building your empathy. I want to temper this with the knowledge that no one is perfect. We are all a bit like swinging pendulums or weights trying to find their balance in this world, which means there will be some times when you make mistakes. There will be some times when you don't quite respond to a certain situation. Instead, you react. But then being able to catch yourself as quickly as possible and then learn from the experience is very important. Eventually, you will get there. So a swinging pendulum, for example, let me see if I have something I can illustrate with this. So this isn't the best example, and this is not what these items are made for, but there we go. So imagine you're a swinging pendulum, right? So this is the top part here. You start off on this extreme, right? It goes like this, and notice that over time, it eventually finds its resting point. So that's just to illustrate that sometimes in this journey of self-development, of being more exposed and being better and doing better, sometimes you will start off where you're at one extreme, you go to another extreme, and eventually you end up in that middle point. And sometimes it takes some time, but you've also got to be patient with yourself in that journey. The next thing I could say is also focused on shared goals. So in a situation where you have a conflict with somebody, oftentimes you also want to realize that it doesn't have to be a winner takes all or a win-lose situation. You actually can look for a win-win situation where everybody feels happy, everybody feels like they're benefiting from the situation, and they don't feel like they are losing out. It's very, very important. And you get further with people, not just for the issue you're dealing with, but for the long-term relationship when you deal on a win-win basis as opposed to a winner takes all type of thing. And oftentimes, if you look hard enough, you will find ways where you can win in that situation, but so can the other person. And you realize that you're working towards a shared goal. I think this can be quite applicable in marriage relationships where you feel like, oh, you've been wronged, or somebody else, maybe you have the upper hand or whatever. Rather than getting into an argument and fighting against your spouse, what you might actually decide to think is, or remember is, you're on the same team. You are your couple team, and you want to make sure that you're able to advance as opposed to fight against each other and in so doing, slow down your advance. So always think, what are ways I can make sure that at the end of this disagreement, we are still together, we are still making progress. Everybody feels like, okay, they've won to some extent in this, and it's not I'm trying to beat the other person down in some way or another. That's something else. And so you want to shift your focus from being right to being fair and constructive. Like I said, move from being right to being fair and constructive. It helps a lot more. And again, it helps with breaking the cycle, because rather than things just spiraling out of control or things like bad things just repeating themselves, instead, you can take a step back and look at, okay, how can we both win in this? How can the unit of the couple actually win from this as opposed to lose? Next, we have healthy boundaries. So first of all, knowing yourself is very important. You can know what you can accept and what you can't accept and what triggers you. Once you know those things, you can know to avoid them, but you can also plan how to deal with those things. So remember earlier where I talked about anger and putting things in place. If you know that you're given to anger, you can prepare in situations where you're not in an upset state for those times later on where you will be. That way you have pre-thought out responses and you know how to deal with them. You can also identify what makes you uncomfortable or what situations make you uncomfortable, and then go out of that way. In terms of setting boundaries as well, setting boundaries is a key one here. You also want to communicate clearly as well. So let people know where your boundaries lie, and so they know when they're crossing those boundaries as well. There are ways of establishing boundaries, but do it in a way that's not necessarily confrontational, but it's still affirming in a sense. So you're not combative, but you're still being firm and saying, okay, this far and no more. And the thing with that is you're going to have to expect that people are going to push against your boundaries. So expect resistance, because people who are used to not respecting your boundaries, they will be encountering you enforcing your boundaries for the first time, and they're going to push, and sometimes they will do so in ways that might be hurtful, but still, rather than being combative, just stand your ground, but explain your stance and let that line be drawn. Eventually they should get the memo. But yeah, and then be consistent. So keep enforcing your boundaries calmly and consistently. This shows other people that they should take your boundaries serious. And I know it's not always easy, and this it sounds theoretical, and you may have some people who are just genuine bullies, and yeah, they don't want to do it, but you also have to keep enforcing it. And then also change your environment where you can. I know it's not always possible, but sometimes if changing your environment would be what helps you to protect your energy, then limit your time in spaces that really trigger you and move towards spaces that don't trigger you. Again, easier said than done, but these are tools to help. So you can limit your contact with people or situations where your boundaries are constantly disregarded. And then another useful tip is to practice saying no without guilt. It's not easy. For some people, it comes easier than others, particularly those who have more people-pleasing tendencies. It can be difficult, but it's a muscle that can be built as well, and it will help you in the long term. But then another side to this is respecting other people's boundaries. You can't expect people to respect your boundaries and then not respect theirs. It works both ways. So whilst you're establishing your own boundaries, be conscious of the areas where you might be disrespecting another person's boundaries. And if you find that you are, apologize and try not to do it again. And you should respect their boundaries, sometimes even when they differ very much from your own. So boundaries could be, for example, some people don't mind people just showing up at their houses. Other people do. If you know this person minds, don't do that. Just give them a call. Let them know you're coming. And then there's also cultivating empathy. I think we're on the 6th one now, just under the different things you can do to reduce the likelihood of you going from victim to oppressor. I'm hoping this makes sense. If this makes sense, let me know in the comments and just type makes sense. That'll let me know, okay, you've gotten this far in the video and what I'm saying actually is helpful in some way. But if you have any questions or things that may not seem clear or well-defined, do let me know. Put them in the questions or in the comments, and I'd love to answer them at some point. So cultivating empathy, that's where we were now. There's a verse of scripture that I really like, and it's also called the golden rule. It's in Matthew 7 verse 12, and it says, so in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. This basically means that you should consider how you would feel if you were in the shoes of the other person who you may have power over or who you may find yourself in an encounter with. How would you want the situation to be treated? And when you think about that, when you know how you would want to be treated if you were in the opposite person's position, then you should treat them in such a way. If you expect mercy in a particular situation, then consider providing mercy or grace in that situation when you are the one in the position to provide that. That's one way of building empathy. And sometimes it takes conscious effort, like I said, but then again, growth mindset, we're all building. We know that we'll make mistakes, but the important thing is to keep swinging towards that point of balance. Another thing is to assume the best of people. Sometimes, you remember when I mentioned earlier about trauma reactions where people tend to overcompensate and then they think, okay, be a bully or be the bullied, and then they choose to be the bully. But actually, maybe you can choose a different way. Maybe you can choose to assume the best of people, still cautiously, still setting your boundaries. But rather than assuming that people are out to get you, maybe it's a case of assuming the best of people, and you might be surprised, actually, people are not always out to get you. People are more concerned about their own issues than yours anyway. So just bear that in mind. And then stay humble, realizing that everybody makes mistakes. You can make mistakes. The other person who you're dealing with can make mistakes. So when you realize that, you want to make sure that you are able to still remain accountable. So knowing that everybody makes mistakes, both you and the other person, remain accountable as well. Let other people let you know, and create situations where people can actually let you know when you have done something wrong or you've wronged somebody else, and to avoid being in a situation where you're constantly the intimidator or the oppressor, as opposed to somebody who breaks the cycle, being the cycle breaker. There are many stories like this. You've got, like the stories I've mentioned so far are bullied becoming the bully. You've got abusive family relationships, like repeating that cycle. You've got people who have an overreactive trauma response where they fear being taken advantage of and interpret every action as somebody wanting to disadvantage them. And so as a result, they act defensively and sometimes going on the attack in order to defend themselves. Whereas you also have to realize that in general, people aren't always out to get you. And so you want to temper that with setting boundaries, but then also applying grace and mercy for people. I've got some self-reflection questions you might want to consider. So things like, what are things that I don't like, but I keep gravitating to? For me, for example, one thing I don't like is being taken for granted. And so if there comes a situation where I feel like, oh, I might be taken for granted, I might overreact, but then I need to consciously tell myself, no, I can communicate clearly what I expect from a particular situation and then not assume that people are going to act a certain way. So putting those boundaries in place in a sense. And for some other people, it may be feeling like they might be disrespected or not respected enough, or it might be a situation where they feel like their boundaries are constantly being pushed. It may be that they don't feel encouraged by other people. It may be that you find yourself constantly in a situation where you are constantly the person who feels like they're being bullied or all that. These are genuine situations, right? But then what you can do is, once you know those situations, like call them out. The first step is actually identifying them. And then the next step would then be thinking, okay, what can I do to mitigate this? What can I do? Is it a case of changing my environment so I'm not in those situations? Is it a case where I establish my boundaries clearly and I communicate them? Communication is very important. And then also look at your ideal, like what would you like to see instead? What would you like the situation to be, and what can you do to actually get closer to that situation? Is there somebody who is in a more ideal situation than you, or that you would aspire to? And then ask yourself, how do I get to that situation? So these are things to consider. It was just a thought that kept going around my mind yesterday, and I just had to offload it into a sort of article sort of form and then create it into a video so I can share it with more people. Now, this is probably a higher level when it comes to exposure and not just dealing with your instincts or personality, but actually thinking about your actions before you take them. But I think in exposing yourself to this, in exposing yourself to ways of managing yourself better, in exposing yourself to how you manage the relationships around you and being conscious of how you cultivate those, I think it will put you in a better stead to be just a better, well-rounded person who knows better, who becomes better, and then who does better. Hope this video was helpful. If you like this video, you should check out the video I did on exposure. I think it's going to pop up on this side of your screen right there. And beyond that, you should also check out some other videos I've put out recently. I'm going to be talking a lot about exposure and just exposing your minds to different things. Some videos will be about me showing you some things to expose you. Other videos would be delving deeper into different aspects of exposure and how it can help you in your day-to-day life. All right, I'll catch you in the next one. Take care and keep getting better. You'll be better and you'll do better. All right, take care.